Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Federalist Society virtual event. I'm Caroline Bryant, and I'm the Deputy Director of Networks at the Federalist Society. Today, we're excited to host this webinar on the FCC Council on National Security. Our moderator today is Megan Brown. Megan heads up Wiley Rein's privacy, cyber, and data governance practice and has been part of the telecoms, media, and technology practice group for 20 years. She handles major transactions that go before the FCC, Team Telecom and CFIUS, and has advised clients on incident response and regulatory compliance. She leads response to agency, congressional investigations, and advising on emerging issues in cyber, supply chain, AI, and harmonization of federal cyber activities. Megan served in the Department of Justice and is now on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Cyber Leadership Council, is a fellow with National Security Institute at George Mason Law School. After we conclude our conversation, we will turn to you, the audience, for questions. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will do our best to answer as many as we can. Finally, I'll note that, as always, all expressions of opinion today are those of our guest speakers, not the Federalist Society. With that, Megan, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Adam, for joining us. For listeners, Adam Chan is currently serving as the National Security Counsel at the Federal Communications Commission in the office of Chairman Brendan Carr. Adam, in that capacity, is Chairman Carr's senior advisor on kind of all national security matters, and that's a pretty broad remit. He joined Chairman Carr's office from Boyd & Gray, where he was an associate, and he had previously served as a law clerk on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Before that, and particularly relevant to today's discussion, Adam served as a National Security Legal Fellow for the U.S. House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party, which, for those of you who haven't been paying attention to that work, has been very busy and very active and doing a lot of high profile and some not high profile, but important things. He also interned at DOJ's National Security Division, also prior in the office of then Commissioner Carr, and at Kirkland & Ellis. He is a Columbia Law grad and a University of Chicago undergrad with highest honors, and he's still affiliated with Columbia Law School's National Security Law program. So I am thrilled to have Adam join us to talk about what the Council on National Security is doing at the Federal Communications Commission and how that agency is thinking about its role in national security, given many of the things that are, in the news and otherwise. So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Megan, for having me, to the Federalist Society for hosting, and to, all of you guys in the audience for tuning in. I think it's, an exciting time, obviously right now, but just in general, these years be working on national security. So it's interesting time for those interested.
Yeah, well, these issues, for anyone who's been paying attention, these are very timely issues. They're also very diverse sets of issues because they cover lots of different technologies and businesses and agencies. And so hopefully this will be educational for folks and give them a slice of what the federal government right now, and the Trump administration in particular, is doing on national security with kind of an all hands approach. So I've got some topics that I'd like to go through. Obviously, Adam, what you want to cover, feel free to steer. But I thought we'd start with kind of your professional path and kind of how you got where you are, and what's passionate to you about the national security space. So maybe tell us about your kind of path in national security and law, and what inspired you to take this job at the FCC at this time.
Yeah, so I guess I sort of first became interested in this national security space maybe about a decade ago, really kind of witnessing China's rise and what that meant. And the unique and novel and really extraordinary threat posed by China, particularly not only just the sort of military threat that I think is a sort of traditional national security threat, but also the threat from a China that dominates the global economy, global technology space, where we are increasingly reliant on China for our supply chains, have cyber vulnerabilities, etc. And China is able to set standards in technology and export its techno-totalitarian model globally. Really think that sort of came into view in Xi Jinping's early tenure as chairman of the Communist Party, and so sort of witnessing that and seeing that as probably the greatest and really existential threat we face in the U.S. really inspired me to kind of focus on this in particular in law school, and then afterwards, as you outlined in law school, was involved in kind of various national security things. Then went to the China Committee, where we focused in particular on the kind of China threat side of things. Additionally, I think of relevance, as Megan mentioned, had interned for then Commissioner Carr when I was in law school, which is how I got connected to this office. And so when President Trump announced that Chairman Carr would be designated as Chairman Carr, got connected to then take a job here to kind of run a sort of new role that he's setting up in the kind of National Security Council role. It's the first time there's been a single point of contact in the chairman's office focused just on national security, which I think shows that Chairman Carr, does prioritize this issue. And so that was, obviously really exciting opportunity, issues I care about, ways to think about kind of creative ways to tackle the national security problem, and obviously the opportunity to work for Chairman Carr, who I think has been an inspiring leader. That's all been kind of great.
And he has not exactly he's not come to his national security interest just recently. I mean, he's been talking about these issues for a very long time, back when he was a commissioner, sort of pointing out certain areas of concern, certain companies or organizations of concern. So I'd like to get in a little bit more about the Council on National Security, and kind of you alluded to kind of it reflects Chairman Carr's focus on this. It is first of its kind, right? Previously, the FCC was not really seen as a national security agency. The people who practiced there knew it had some lanes that were actually, pretty important and impactful to the private sector. But can you elaborate a little bit more about what problem the chairman is trying to solve by creating this new council?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I guess one quick point I'd make is, while it's true that the FCC has in recent years not really been thought of as a national security agency, actually, as the pitch I would make to the Federalist Society, a sort of really like originalist understanding of the FCC would suggest that it was in fact originally set up very much focused on a national security mission. In fact, like Section 1, Communications Act 1934, talks about sort of one of the two central purposes of the FCC was national defense. That remains one of the key sort of purposes we have. When I look outside my office, all the old chairs of the FCC and its predecessor, the Federal Radio Commission, on the wall, like the earliest chairman, are all in military garb. And so it was sort of originally set up given communications relevance in the national security context. I think we see now just how critical communications networks are in the military context, especially some recent technology. I mean, beyond just radio, we now have satellite communication. We've seen how Starlink in the sort of private satellite space has a major role to play in the conflicts, both in Ukraine and the Middle East. We've seen drones, which use FCC regulated spectrum and get authorized by the FCC, play a critical military role. Submarine cables have been in the news a lot lately. So all that's to say, I think there's some sort of key kind of traditional national security roles there. Also, I guess sort of turning kind of more recently, I think the FCC has been much more involved, especially on the China tech threat side of things. Both sort of revoking authorizations to engage in international telecommunication services through the Section 214 process against like some Chinese state-owned telecom providers, part of a kind of global counter Huawei and ZTE program. We've had a rip and replace program where Congress actually finally appropriated an additional round of money, but we have an appropriation to basically get carriers in the US to rip out Huawei and ZTE equipment, replace it with trusted providers. And then I think sort of most relevantly in the last few years, Congress has actually acted with two statutes, the Secure Networks Act and the Secure Equipment Act, both of which authorized and in fact required us to create a list of untrustworthy equipment and services deemed to pose an unacceptable risk to national security, that one would sort of go on our covered list and wouldn't be allowed in networks, but would also, most importantly, would be prohibited from receiving authorization for import, market, or sale in the US going forward. And so that's equipment like Huawei's equipment, but also Hikvision cameras. And the list can, evolve and grow as more and more agencies, can make determinations to add to that list. So all that's to say, I mean, I think there's a lot going on now in the national security space, in sort of China tech space. And I think all those reasons are why I think Chairman Carr wanted someone, in his office who could prioritize these issues.
Yeah, and I think all that's a really good overview for those of you who maybe aren't FCC practitioners. Adam covered a lot of different pieces of the FCC's mission. And I do just want to flag for folks on the call, there are some very interesting, and we're not going to, I think, have a debating society right now. There are some interesting questions, I think, about the scope of the FCC's specific and general grants of authority when you've got, for instance, these recent enactments by Congress that are very specific and directive to say, hey, we're ratifying, for example, what Chairman Pai put in place on some of the restrictions that he had envisioned before Congress acted. But I think there are some real questions about the scope of the general national security role of the FCC when it comes to specific activities. And I think for Federalist Society folks who are interested in those questions, lots of things to look at when you're reading an FCC order, or maybe some of the judicial activity that has come out of the FCC and some of its actions, thinking how those will map onto perhaps some of the national security steps that the agency is contemplating. But I know you guys are very thoughtful and are thinking about all of those interesting ad law questions.
I mean, 100%. I mean, just one sort of quick point on that. I mean, I think it's definitely something, as a member of the, Federalist Society, very much sort of by the, we are an agency that only exercises authority insofar as Congress has granted us that authority. And we are not the sort of one-stop shop for all things national security. There are other agencies that take the lead there, but when it does sort of affect core communications networks, that is something where, the FCC has a kind of critical role to play, but I think we are trying to be careful to not overstep our jurisdiction.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And it highlights to me one of the challenges that maybe we'll discuss in a bit about that coordination with the other stakeholders that play in the national security space. But real quick, can you give us a sense of who's on this council? Is this all an internal group? Is it external people too? Is it interagency? What kind of is it?
Yeah, so we set up this council a few months ago. I think for those who don't really know the FCC has like sort of 16 different offices and bureaus, mostly organized by technology or subject matter expertise. So we have like a space bureau and a wireline bureau and a media bureau. And we also have a separate Office of General Counsel and an enforcement bureau that enforces our rules. And so the council sort of brings together representatives from all of these different bureaus into one organization, breaks down silos, enables information sharing, to really sort of coordinate and allow the chairman to kind of drive an agenda on national security that cuts across all of this and ensures, a sort of institutional memory. There are people in every bureau who are sort of cognizant of and tracking the national security concerns. So as of now, I mean, the actual sort of members of the council are all sort of internal FCC employees. But I think one sort of critical role is to kind of elevate the FCC's national security role, both to the wider public and industry, but then also to the interagency and that kind of thing.
Right. So I think I would like to pause for a minute on kind of your mission and what I understand to be kind of your three-part goals, which is supply chain security, guarding against cyber and espionage threats, and then ensuring leadership in critical tech. And those are three really big, goals. So maybe you could kind of break down what they each mean and give maybe an example of kind of a work stream or what that might mean to the new listener to understand what that means at the FCC.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's great. A great point. Those really are kind of three mission sets, I guess, taking them taking them in turn, I think the supply chain aspect, perhaps sort of most important in terms of our sort of risk from China. We are incredibly, as is sort of well known, dependent on Chinese tech, Chinese supply chains for a whole range of goods. I mean, some of these are definitively not in the FCC jurisdiction, like pharmaceutical supplies or rare earth minerals or something like that, where like the FCC is not going to take the leading role. But many of these, I mean, for example, like drones, which I mentioned, is a big thing where we are very, very dependent on China for drones. So there are potential concerns there. Additionally, on the cyber, espionage side, I think we see this either with, the covered list has a lot of video surveillance technology, really is focused on a kind of espionage, cybersecurity risk. We've also been coordinating closely with the interagency and some of the intelligence agency partners on Salt Typhoon, and perhaps even scarier, Volt Typhoon, which is another Chinese cyber attack that got less attention. But the sort of long and short of it is China has inserted malware and other potential cyber attack, cyber so it basically has inserted problematic software, malware, hardware into critical infrastructure throughout the U.S. in the case of, say, a war over Taiwan, that they could sort of activate that to take out a lot of critical infrastructure. And then I guess on the sort of strategic technology leadership, this is more on the promote side, working closely with industry to help accelerate American technology advancement, promoting U.S. tech stack abroad, but also streamlining regulations to accelerate, U.S. leadership in AI or 5G and 6G, like that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And all those things do sort of touch on, I think, the president's agenda on promoting investment in the United States, promoting U.S. tech dominance, and maybe we can get into that in a bit. I did want to give you an opportunity to highlight maybe a few major initiatives that you care about or that you'd like people to know about, right? The council was announced, and then shortly thereafter, I think it was the chairman announced some investigations into some Chinese companies on the covered list and sort of some different things going on there. There's several rulemakings underway that touch on or really squarely address national security. You've got the proceeding on overseas labs, sort of the testing labs issue we refer to, the proceeding as the bad labs proceeding. You've got foreign adversary ownership review for folks who don't practice before the FCC. The FCC, because it authorizes license transfers and has to bless foreign ownership of certain things that are heavily regulated in the US, there is a national security process there. And I think the FCC is looking at how that process works, because it is interagency right now, with the FCC sort of playing kind of, I don't know if you'd call yourselves the hub of it, and then the spokes that go out to DOJ and DHS. But there's that proceeding. There's a proceeding on connected cars that's kind of a supply chain piece that's of great interest. I'm curious if there's anything in particular of all of these many initiatives you kind of want to emphasize as something that folks should be paying particular attention to.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Happy to talk about, any of that in the Q&A if you all have follow-ups, or, always, of course, feel free to, reach out to me separately. I guess one I'd highlight, as I think sort of encompasses a lot of the threats we're talking about, is the Bad Labs proceeding, where we adopted final rules last month. I'd note this, along with pretty much everything else I work on, was adopted unanimously, bipartisan fashion, continuing a sort of tradition under Chairman Pai and Chairwoman Rosenworcel. This proceeding, sort of every person I tell this to is kind of stunned that this is in fact the case, because it really is sort of crazy situation we have. But basically, as I mentioned, in order to sell almost any tech product in the US, basically anything with, that emits radio frequency, so that's anything with Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, that kind of thing. So this is phones, computers, drones, IoT devices, server equipment, that kind of thing, has to be authorized by the FCC. And as part of that, it needs to get tested. So this is tested for both to make sure it doesn't emit harmful frequency and disrupt communications, to ensure it complies with technical specifications, but also to ensure it doesn't use any prohibited equipment on our covered list. So, any like Huawei equipment or that kind of thing. As of now, 75% of that testing takes place in China, which, sort of talk about supply chain dependencies is sort of a crazy statistic, especially because, this is a sort of critical activity that the FCC has, needs to trust these private entities to do the testing. Often these Chinese labs are owned directly by the Chinese government, owned by national champions. One, until last year, was even owned by Huawei. So we had a sort of insane situation where the Huawei-owned lab had to, among other things, certify that the products were not, in fact, Huawei products. Some obvious reasons we wouldn't trust that. Additionally, there are risks here of potential malware inserted into products. Chinese labs can gain access, and thus, one Chinese lab does, the whole Chinese government does gain access to U.S. Technology, IP, learn about the U.S. market through this process. So in any event, we are taking action there. Last month, we adopted rules to basically withdraw recognition from labs that are owned by or subject to the jurisdiction or the direction or control of the Chinese government or other foreign adversary labs. And then also we have a further notice where we propose to go further and withdraw recognition from all labs based in China, even as we streamline and accelerate and seek comments on how we can incentivize further testing in the US or allied countries. So it's sort of, even as we are cutting off foreign adversaries, looking at how we can, reindustrialize and accelerate nearshore, onshore, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, for the audience, right, these proceedings are done sort of by notice and comment in the kind of familiar dance that happens. To the extent you're interested in these issues, you can find your way to the docket. You can always reach out to me. I can tell you how to find it. But the FCC is taking in comment on the wisdom of their proposals, perhaps unintended consequences, economic impacts, right? When you're dealing with testing, supply chain impacts are real. And, so there's a robust record being developed about kind of the implementation issues. And it kind of raised a question in my mind, which is, how do you, Adam, how do you coordinate perhaps with, say, like the Department of Commerce or BIS? Because some of the consequences of choices you guys make will have ripple effects across other parts of the economy, including folks who are not directly regulated by the FCC. Just be curious if you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I mean, I think we coordinate very closely with our interagency partners. I mean, I think a regular part of my day is phone calls with DOJ, with Commerce. We interact a lot with the White House, like NSC, NEC, which helps sort of deconflict potential overlapping jurisdictions. I think that is a sort of critical piece of this. I think, and it's also helpful, you mentioned this connected vehicle proceeding. Obviously, connected vehicles and sort of the auto industry is not sort of the industry that the FCC is most familiar with. And so being able to coordinate closely with Commerce, that was sort of the agency to take initial action in making a determination that would potentially add connected vehicle parts to the covered list, was, I think, very, very valuable. Then I'd say on the sort of open docket, we're always eager to get comments. So, even in the Bad Labs proceeding that I mentioned, the further notice, I think, should be published in the Federal Register any day now. And at that point, the comment period will be open. So, think about filing.
Yeah, I think some people kind of, you notice not everyone is kind of aware of the breadth of what the FCC considers and does. And so sometimes you're sort of wondering, like, why more people didn't file in that docket?
Yep.
But no, super helpful. So can we sort of pivot to foreign investment and sort of some of these regulatory reform issues? The president and the chairman have been talking about the need to sort of encourage investment in the United States. particularly in critical infrastructure, particularly in AI, in communications. And so that's clearly a message that folks have heard, right? That if the US is going to lead in tech and AI, we're going to need robust infrastructure here in the United States. And I know Chairman Carr has been a champion of infrastructure since he was, a WE associate fighting for local zoning to get out of the way of certain investment. But the president issued a memorandum on the American First investment policy and the need to kind of focus some regulations and national security obligations like those that are imposed by DOJ, DHS, and DOD through the team telecom process. And I will say, we've probably submitted some comments that have noted some of the burdens from the team telecom process. I know others have observed it can take a long time. And I'm curious for your thoughts, to the extent you can share them, on sort of what the agency is doing, what the council is thinking when it considers the national security impacts of foreign investment and the review of that versus the desire to streamline regulations and tighten them up so that you're not inadvertently burdening allies and friends and infrastructure that we so badly need.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I guess to the audience, brief kind of overview if you're sort of not familiar with team telecom. Basically, this is a process whereby for certain licenses, such as submarine cable landing licenses, for certain foreign investment in the telecom sector, that the FCC has to approve. We often submit these, licenses to what's called team telecom, which is a committee of DOJ, DHS, and DOD to review for potential national security concerns. And they can then recommend we block it or grant mitigation or what have you. It's sort of a parallel process to CFIUS, which some of you may be more familiar with. I think on your point, I think the America First investment policy memo is excellent. I think we strongly support and are trying to sort of act in all ways consistent with that. I think the sort of two basic prongs of that are, a hard line against China and foreign adversaries, especially in the, sort of critical tech space. And so this means, things like, presumption of denial, that kind of thing. Really looking at any sort of ties for Chinese ownership, Chinese equipment, that kind of thing. Even as we, streamline and reduce regulations, reduce review for entities and for transactions, for licenses that don't pose those sort of risks. Because I think we recognize, as you said, Megan, I mean, not only is it sort of beneficial economically to have a streamlined process and reduce costs, it's also in our national security interest to maximize this investment. If you take submarine cables, for example, which we do have an ongoing proceeding on, where I think you'll see soon enough, but been hoping to implement some of this. There is a real national security imperative in resilience in our submarine cable infrastructure, whereby we have like more cables that are, owned and controlled and run responsibly, even as there is a threat from, foreign adversaries in the sort of cable ecosystem.
Yeah, no, super helpful. And I think the audience really benefits from understanding how you and the agency are kind of thinking about these things. I will say, you've been very open, and I think the agency very much wants this input as it considers how to adjust and how to address the national security issues with also sort of smart regulation that encourages investment, is favorable to our allies, and sort of promotes that mission. If we could jump real quick into sort of the threat landscape, and without asking you to reveal anything you shouldn't, I am curious if, there's a lot obviously in the news. The council was formed around and amid sort of concerns about communications network security, nation state adversaries. And I was curious if you could just share some thoughts for people who are not maybe cyber nerds or national security nerds, kind of what do you think of as the most pressing threats right now to sort of US communications networks and infrastructure?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's, sort of the answer is China. That, I mean, I talked some about Volt Typhoon, but on the cyber front, China really has embedded itself in a lot of critical infrastructures, continues to try to do so. I know, folks like the FBI have talked publicly about the just bombardment by Chinese cyber attackers, hackers that we're seeing. I think also, as I mentioned, drones is something that really does keep me up at night. We saw, I think, a spectacularly successful effort by Ukraine to use sort of drones smuggled into Russia to attack Russian, nuclear like the nuclear bombing fleet, basically. Right now, vast majority of commercial drones operating in the United States are controlled by a Chinese military company. It's insane that a foreign adversary has control over, literally millions of commercial drones in the United States. It's obviously something that I think is problematic. And then on the critical technology side, we're seeing China sort of race ahead in a lot of key areas like robotics. Drones we talked about, like EVs and batteries. Huawei has like reemerged as a sort of key player. China's catching up in AI. I think one thing that does scare me is AI. Many people think the sort of future of AI will be determined by who can, has the greatest scale in terms of data and data processing. And if it's a question of who can scale fastest, who can build infrastructure fastest, I really worry about our ability to compete with China on that score, given what they've done in the last couple decades.
We did not discuss this question beforehand, but it's a little bit of a curveball. But your comments about AI kind of made me think of it. Are you guys participating, interested in, troubled, pleased by the discussions in Congress on various AI policy solutions, right? We do a lot of work in this space and are watching keenly, right? Is Congress interested in ousting the states of some of their AI regulation? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but curious kind of for your thoughts as you watch, having been on the Hill and kind of just watching the AI policy discussions. The FCC has a slice of that, obviously, but curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, I think don't want to sort of get out in front of the commission in terms of like endorsing or unendorsing, I guess, any sort of pending legislation. But I think definitely watching the space closely and certainly sort of interested in what we can do to assist the broader administration's goals on AI as well as the support U.S. national security through our authorities there. Got
it. So one thing as I was thinking about kind of trends and what people should be thinking about as administration changes and kind of what's new or novel. I am curious, there's been a long history, and I've been very privileged to be parts of it on sort of this industry engagement and partnership with both the FCC, but also with DHS, the national security agencies in the area of cyber and in the area of resilience and critical infrastructure. And sort of for years, that was kind of the bedrock of sort of federal cyber policy was, let's remove some obstacles to cooperation. There's legislation coming up for renewal in the fall that is pretty important to that, the cyber information sharing framework. But right, there's a whole history of collaboration and partnership. And I'm curious sort of what more, I know the chairman has talked about a lot of these things, but what more would you like to see from industry in that space? Because I think industry has felt for a long time, it's been a very, collaborative partner with the government to meet concerns and address things, but I'm curious what you kind of would like to see more of.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think we really value that and sort of like the more engagement, the better, as a general matter. I think, in general, we appreciate when it's collaborative engagement, when industry comes in and says, oh, we want to recognize this is a priority. We want to work with you on how we can sort of implement this in the best way possible, rather than, sort of, this is outrageous, how can you possibly do this, or that kind of thing. I think in general, we like it if industry, files comments in open proceedings, rather than sort of coming in on the last day before we're going to vote on the proceeding, having not commented and raising some issue, that kind of thing. I think, for example, on the connected vehicle issue that you noted, a group of industry associations came in and requested an extension of time to file public input. We were very, they were eager to sort of work collaboratively in how we can implement this, rather than saying, this is an outrageous, assault on America, that we then, granted the extension of time, have been meeting with. industry folks. And so I think that's been all to the good. I think other things that it would be very helpful from industry is if you have any information on things that maybe some of your competitors are doing that violate FCC rules, or filings that are maybe untruthful by certain foreign adversary companies or other entities, or most especially on this third pillar and third goal of the council in terms of U.S. tech dominance, innovation, accelerating U.S. leadership, building out infrastructure. If you have any ideas, suggestions of ways we can streamline or regulate or deregulate or provide incentives to assist with private sector innovation or infrastructure building, and please don't hesitate to kind of reach out, recommend things both formally and informally as we go forward.
Did you get a fair bit of input along those lines in the chairman's delete proceeding? And I'm curious if your council has been kind of pouring through that docket for ideas.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I mean, I think that was great. For those who don't know, Chairman Carr put out a ongoing proceeding called Delete, which basically calls on all members of the public to submit recommendations for regulations we can delete that maybe don't serve their purpose, or about outdated technology, or the costs way exceed the benefits, that kind of thing. So definitely interested in that. Definitely also interested in things, not even deregulation, but changes to regulation that we can also, sort of streamline and accelerate and help achieve, sort of national security goals by promoting U.S. innovation.
Great. Yeah. And it's interesting. I think, a lot of folks look at those and those proceedings and the OMB one, and there's several that kind of picked up that theme that Chairman Carr went out early with. And I think some folks are wondering, is it legit? Should we really go in? And my perspective has always been, you're not going to get what you don't ask for. So you probably should go in and ask.
100%. The more of that, the better.
So let's talk for a minute, because I do feel like, I've worked with and supported some of the work by the CISRIC for a while, and I thought we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about that. This is the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, which I literally have to pull up every time because I can say CISRIC really well, but it's very difficult for me to get through the full proper name of it. I was curious if you, to me, this sort of goes with this public-private partnership model. It also seems like it's a useful place to talk about balancing innovation, and kind of, there's a lot of really technical work that gets done there. I don't know that I would encourage all the listeners to go pull up the latest CISRIC reports, but some of them are really quite thorough and have a lot of good stuff in there. So I'm kind of curious if you could address CISRIC and kind of what, I know the chairman was at the recent meeting, and sort of just give the audience a sense of what CISRIC does, why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think why CISRIC matters is sort of a lot of what we were saying. I mean, it allows for private sector input, advice, suggestions, and also their technical expertise. And so really allows for greater engagement with industry. As you mentioned, there was a recent meeting of the CISRIC. I think the sort of new CISRIC priorities that the chairman announced were going to be focused on are, AI, both sort of opportunities and potential threats, as well as like 911 calling, which is somewhat outside my area that I deal with, but obviously a priority for Chairman Carr and the commission.
Great. So just sort of as we're getting to the end of our time together, I was curious if you could talk about any, and I know it's still very early for the council, so maybe we can do this again in next year or in a couple of years as well, but kind of thinking about early wins and kind of how you and the chairman think about what success looks like, right? Because there's a process point and an outcome point. I'm just sort of curious, what does winning to you guys for the council look like in a year or two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm hesitant to talk about specifics because we do have an agenda of specific things we would like to get done that aren't ready for public release. But I think in a broad level, there's sort of two kind of broad areas. One being kind of specific progress on each of the three goals that the council has stood up, that we can point to actual rules that we have adopted, or changes to rules, or deregulation items, anything like specific things where we have changed the law to actually promote those goals and achieve sort of substantive wins. And then I think secondly, is to again sort of elevate the FCC's stature when it comes to national security, so that entities in the interagency, in Congress, in industry, look to the FCC as a key player in these conversations.
Yeah, that's great. And we do have a couple of questions. So before I go to my last couple, maybe I don't know if you've been tracking them, Adam, but I'm taking a peek now. I am kind of curious. Some are a little they may ask you to kind of get real specific, and I don't know if you want to, but one is about, is the council involved in addressing vulnerabilities in sort of second, third, and down tier suppliers in the defense industrial base? The point made by the commenter is many are small businesses that may not have kind of the scale or sophistication. I'm curious for your reaction. This may also be an example where you might want to talk about coordination with other agencies, because there's certainly a lot that DoD, the Federal Acquisition Supply Council, and others are doing in this space, but curious for your kind of reaction to that question from the audience.
No, I mean, 100%. I think it's a huge problem. Ultimately, it's primarily going to be DoD when we're talking specifically about the defense industrial base, but obviously a lot of these components have dual use. I think one of the scariest conversations I've ever had was a conversation when I was back on the Hill with a lobbyist from a defense contractor that supplies the U.S. Air Force. This was sort of in like just a week after the Secretary of the Air Force had announced China's preparing for war against the United States. A representative from this a defense contractor came in and announced a great fanfare that they had a new strategy to remove all Chinese suppliers from there by 2030, which is 7 years away. Even though we may well be at war with China before then, apparently they were still going to be relying on Chinese suppliers for that. And in fact, even by 2030, they would still be reliant and wouldn't have even looked at potential second, third, and fourth tier suppliers, potentially from China. So it's ultimately, for me, kind of not clear how we can potentially fight a war with China if we in fact can't produce any planes without Chinese components. And so all that to say, I mean, I think I am certainly very focused and very concerned with our reliance on, second, third, fourth tier suppliers in this space. One sort of pending action that the FCC is considering that sort of addresses this issue is right now our covered list. We prohibit authorization for equipment that is listed on our covered list. So, for example, a Huawei phone, for example. But we do not have any restrictions on equipment that uses components produced by Huawei. And so we have an open proceeding now. This is back further notice of proposed rulemaking from Chairwoman Rosenworcel's day, following up on the Secure Equipment Act, where that is an open thing that the commission has been looking at. And so so I think all that to say, I mean, certainly component parts are a key issue. Often we have to address this by, sort of either directly regulating or enforcing against the actual regulatees rather than their suppliers, but we can sort of address the issue of broader supply chain concerns through that.
Yeah. And I think that's those kinds of things are a great example of the complexities of some of these issues, and the possible knock-on and economic effects of activity at one level of the supply chain or the economy, and sort of that importance of working with commerce and kind of understanding what that looks like. So I think one other question we got is asking if you could identify some of the China-based companies associated with the typhoons. And you've mentioned a couple of the typhoons. And if you think it's important for us to know that, I'll put that out there. There's a reference to an investigation into TP-Link and sort of a router manufacturer. I don't know if you want to elaborate on anything. Just wanted to flag the question.
Yeah, I mean, good question. Not going to flag any sort of specific companies, and obviously the TP-Link, I'll sort of let Commerce talk about their specific investigation. From sort of our authorities there, I think usually we are not the agency to identify specific companies as the threat. that we really rely either for the covered list or for Team Telecom. We rely on other sort of agencies to make those determinations. So for example, like in the Bad Labs proceeding, we relied on the Commerce Department's definition of foreign adversaries. We relied on, DOD's list of Chinese military companies. We relied on, the Commerce Department's entity list, et cetera, et cetera. And so if an entity such as the Bureau of Industry and Security of Commerce were to make a determination about TP-Link or any other company's equipment, we would take action to put it on the covered list as we are required to do. But it's unlikely going to be the FCC decides, oh, we think Chinese equipment maker X is a big threat, and therefore we independently are going to unilaterally decide to take action against them.
Yeah. I think our last question is about chip security, and I'm curious if you want to bite on the question about whether certain Chinese manufactured chips have certain capabilities in them, and maybe more broadly, if you want to weigh in on kind of the semiconductor discussions that have been going on. Maybe that relates more to your time on the Hill, but curious if you have any thoughts to share.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, our vulnerabilities there are huge from Chinese chips and just the lack of US production. Had been working on the Hill a lot. I think sort of one area where we do get it, some of this is some of the equipment to produce, as well as semiconductors are obviously a key components. So insofar as we look at components, component parts produced by entities on the covered list, their potential, potential to look at semiconductors there as well. I noticed also someone has their hand up. I don't really know how to call on someone, but if they want to put their question in the Q&A, we're happy to sort of answer that too.
That's great. Good eye. I did not notice that, Adam. So thank you. Yeah, drop it in the chat if you can. And then I thought we would maybe close with a couple of more general questions. One is, can you comment, we saw at the beginning of the Trump administration a whole lot of activity focused on government efficiency. And I'm curious if you could comment on how the FCC as an agency kind of responded to the president's calls and sort of whether that affected your national security mission or sort of led to a reprioritization, but just sort of, I think that's timely for folks who probably wonder how the FCC handled or was affected by those early administration trends.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, obviously the commission has taken on its sort of responsibility to promote efficiency pretty strongly. We've been, working closely with the broader administration. I have not been the sort of leading person in the agency working on sort of DOGE related efforts. That said, I mean, obviously we have announced sort of savings on, major contracts, and certainly I obviously support the broader mission to be efficient in everything we do. We talked about the delete proceeding. We are trying to streamline and cut regulations where possible. Often, even as we adhere to the sort of 10-to-1 ratio of cutting regulations to adding new regulations, the national security stuff often falls in the one base. And then I think it's, I mean, I think a lot of folks here will sort of acknowledge what one area where they definitely think sort of government unquestionably has a role is in this sort of national security space. I think one area where I'm particularly excited, and you all should be particularly excited if you use, FCC filing interfaces or other databases, is looking at sort of ways we can modernize IT to promote efficiency on that score, where I think a lot can be done there. So that'll help with sort of national security, but also sort of other efforts as well.
Very much welcome, as my colleagues and our legal assistants and our teams very much would welcome that. And then I guess my last question is kind of any advice for anyone. We often get law students dialing into these, and I'm curious if you could share any advice for folks early in their career who might have an interest, as you did, in national security, in cyber, and kind of these important issues.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think it's a good question. I guess maybe two pieces of advice generally. Maybe three pieces of advice. One is like always feel free to like reach out to me and sort of we can talk one-on-one. But I guess second piece of advice is this really is a whole of society effort, I think, to protect US national security, counter the threat from China, that is not only a government effort. So even if you are not currently in government and don't really want to go into government, there are things you can do in the sort of academic space, in the nonprofit space, in private industry, etc. And so, I mean, I think, definitely consider sort of getting involved and sort of helping the mission more generally. I think other kind of specific pieces of advice for people with like interested in the career in national security law is like I think choose potential jobs less by the job title you'll have or sort of specific prestige associated with that job and more like associated with the boss that you'll have. Like I think it's important to have like really good bosses who one like treat their employees well, but also I think sort of are aligned on the mission, and you think will sort of give you the sort of support needed to pursue the mission. And I think I've been like very lucky so far in my career and obviously working with Chairman Carr. And so I think would definitely recommend that to those interested.
Yeah, well, I mean, it looks like, you auspiciously ended up interning for Commissioner Carr, and look, how all of those things kind of circle together. So a little bit of a plug there for internships at the FCC for those law students out
there. and we in Chairman Carr's office are, like we'll be hiring or might still be hiring interns for, during the law school year and for next summer. So if you're at all interested, like obviously, feel free to reach out to apply, etc.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time. I know you have a very busy docket and really appreciate you shedding some light on what you guys are doing over there with the Federalist Society. So thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, no. Thank you very much. Thank you all. And yeah, hope you all have a great day. And thank you to you, Megan, and thank you to the Federalist Society again.
Great. Well, thank you guys. And thanks again, Adam, for joining us. Thank you also to the audience members who joined us. We greatly appreciate your participation. Check out our website, fedsoc.org, or follow us on all major social media platforms at FedSoc to stay up to date with announcements and upcoming webinars. Thank you once more for tuning in. And with that, we are adjourned.